Hi there, this is Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. My name is Ian Willoughby. My guest in this episode is the veteran US film journalist Steven Gaydos. Steven wrote a lovely tribute in Variety to Jiří Bartoška following his death last Thursday. And I thought it could be good to hear some more of his memories of the president of the Karlovy International Film Festival. The Czech actor took the reins at the festival in 1994, and that was also the first edition for Steven Gaydos, who subsequently watched Bartoška and his team turn a moribund event into the vibrant, internationally renowned celebration of cinema that it is today. So this is me talking to Steven Gaydos for this edition of Prague Talk. You first attended the Karlovy Film Festival in 1994. What led you to go to the 29th edition?
In 1994, I had just started my 32-year run at Variety. And there were some folks in Los Angeles who were of Czech descent and knew the people with the festival and knew that they were trying to get attention in Hollywood. And they thought it was a good idea to invite a Los Angeles Variety-based journalist.
And in those days, Karlovy was just a few years after the end of communism. It was in a period of transition. What was it actually like then?
Ian, that is such a great question, because when I wrote the article about the sad passing of Jiří Bartoška, one thing I didn't put in the article was what it was like year one. By 1997, it had changed completely. But in 1994, the theaters were almost completely empty. There were a lot of nice guests. They brought in a lot of nice VIPs, but there was nobody in the theaters to speak of. I think the ceremonies were fairly well attended, but if you went anywhere, the student hordes of students that became a hallmark of Karlovy were nowhere in sight. Again, this is another accomplishment of Jiří Bartoška and his team, that they transformed this festival that basically no one was going to into this vibrant, lively gathering.
What's your sense of how he achieved that, obviously with Eva Zaoralova, the artistic director?
You know, I think in those first 2 or 3 years, Rudy Bierman was working with him. He was a very hard-charging, creative guy. And the team, the three of them, were very dynamic and ambitious. And then, you know, one of the many accomplishments of Jiří is he transitioned away from having a partner. Then when Eva retired, he transitioned away from having a known person running the programming. And he really recruited these young people. Krzysztof Mucha had told me he was a 22-year-old student when he started. I remember they were like children. And, you know, he must have been an astonishingly good leader and collaborator, and he must have directed and listened and collaborated, because that team for decades is really in place, with Tatiana Detlefsen helping bring these stellar names over to the festival. The combination of the team with Jiří leading them, and as I said in my article, you know, when you saw the limo, you know, you saw the town car, the Mercedes pull up with Sharon Stone or some movie star in front of the poop, and there was Jiří greeting them. Movie stars were greeted by a real movie star. It was fantastic.
Well, I remember when Richard Gere came, seeing photos of the two of them, and frankly, Bartoška looked better than Richard Gere.
No, there's nobody outshined Jiří. And if you look at those early photographs, you see, you know, at the beginning of his career, he was a good-looking kid, and he grew into a great-looking man, and he had movie star swagger without being, you know, pretentious or a jerk, you know.
What was he like at the personal level? We've seen many tributes to him, but how did you find him personally?
You know, he didn't bother to learn English. So there was always something a little off, because he wasn't glad-handing and reaching over the water to speak in language, but he had people who were very able at translating. He was always very warm. He had another word I didn't really use in my article in Variety was debonair. And also, I think there is an Eastern European charm. You have to forgive me. I am an American, and I've grown up on movies. And if you have an ideal in your mind of that Eastern European old world charm, a kind of patrician elegance, while all the time being very friendly. And of course, he loved to golf. And half of the people who come to Karlovy Vary share that love, and I don't. So I wasn't able to share the love of golf, but I saw with my own eyes all the people who came with him.
I saw a photo from 1994 of Václav Havel, Max von Sydow, or Sydow, if I'm saying it right, and Jiří Bartoška. In the background was you. Tell us about some of the people that you met, either at the first edition you went to or at later ones.
Oh, over, 10, 15, 20 years, some of the greatest nights of my life in festival life. I've been attending film festivals since the 80s, and or even earlier. I was attending a thing called Filmex in the 70s in Los Angeles. No, I don't know how much went into the article. I put a lot of anecdotes. One of my favorite is there was a security detail around Lauren Bacall, who was a genuine old, golden era star, Bogey's wife, Humphrey Bogart's wife. And my brother Frank was there with me. And he went over politely and asked if he could dance with Miss Bacall to this wonderful Czech swing band. And of course, they told him to get lost. And being a blue collar kid like me, who doesn't take no for an answer, he just waited till they left, went straight to Miss Bacall and said, "Would you like to dance?" And she said, "I would love to." And that's the greatest night of his life. On my list is hanging out with Morgan Freeman and singing Coaster songs and talking movies with Gus Van Sant and Abbas Kiarostami. And, there were so many intimate dinners. I'm a huge fan of the Pythons. And to be there with Terry Jones one year and to be hanging out for like an entire week with John Cleese, these are my comedy heroes. And there's an intimacy and a casual quality to these encounters in Karlovy Vary. Cannes is frantic, high-level, security, everything bureaucratic you can imagine. It's very tough. Maybe if you're Leonardo DiCaprio, it all works, but I'm not. In Karlovy Vary, it's always seemed like you're going to be sitting next to someone like Richard Gere or Jude Law and just chatting casually, and nobody seems to have their guard up, So it's been fantastic.
And you met DiCaprio when he was famously there as a teenager with his German grandparents.
Well, I love the fact that Variety, we had written an article about that wonderful photographer who did those photos over the years. And so when I tell the story that Leo was there as a teenager with his German grandparents kind of in their laps, we have the black and white photo of teenage Leo, who looks about 12, with his German grandparents on a bench in a park in Karlovy Vary. What a great memory and just funny, wonderful times. And I ran into him later, years and years later, with his mother, Ermeline, who's a wonderful lady. And she said, hey, Leo, that was our first film festival. And so Karlovy Vary was the first film festival Leonardo DiCaprio ever attended.
Another good friend of the festival was Milos Forman. Do you think Forman and Havel were a kind of asset to the festival in terms of drawing names?
Yeah, inestimable, Ian. And again, a great question, because Václav Havel is one of the heroes of democracy and politics and literature of the 20th century. He was a giant. He didn't behave like a giant. I watched football with him and Jiří one year. I believe the Czechs didn't go through, but we all sat around, in a wonderful little room watching football, and he couldn't have been a more genuine, down-to-earth person. But he was a magnet, because the idea that you could shake hands with one of the towering figures of the century, and then, of course, Milos was that in the world of cinema. He was one of the great figures of 20th century cinema. And
didn't Variety have some kind of a section at the festival?
Yeah, we the festival did something innovative that Cannes, Berlin, Venice never would dare to do. They put our critics and reporters and writers in charge of a section, and we programmed for 15, 20 years, we programmed something called Europe Now. And I met the whole new generation in the 90s of new, great, emerging filmmakers. And those screenings were always packed, always sold out. That was a big deal for the filmmakers who were new and emerging. And we did parties with them together and had wonderful times. Variety was really essential to the rise of Karlovy Vary's international profile and reputation, because we were, partnering with them, engaged with them, writing about them. We have so many fantastic critics who would attend Variety and review these movies. We gave it its due. We didn't do something, like extra special. We just gave it what it deserved, because we're the Bible of show business from 1905. I found an article about filming near Karlovy Vary in like 1917. So we've been covering the territory a long time.
And getting back to Jiří Bartoška, what are the qualities that he brought to being the president of the festival that will be lost now, that won't be there from the upcoming edition on?
I think the whole is that this Robert Redford, elegant, like you said, every bit the equal of a Richard Gere or a Jude Law, the movie star ambassador, the ambassador for the festival, this person who is a very larger than life, wonderful, warm character, is gone. But the continuity of his team, his program, artistic director, Carol Oak, and his executive director of the festival, Krzysztof Mucha, and Tatiana continues working with him on the Academy films and the stars and the filmmakers from Los Angeles. There's a fantastic continuity. So there's no sense, I have no sense, that the festival misses a beat in terms of its infrastructure and its sponsors and its grandeur. It loses the little bit of luster and grandeur because their hero has passed away.
So as far as you're concerned, no reason at all for pessimism?
Oh, not in the least, because, I don't have the statistics in front of me. But if it were a time of transition, there is no transition. These people know each other. They work well together. They've been working well with Jiří and the sponsors. There's a maturity because Krzysztof Mucha is not a 22-year-old student anymore. He produces fantastic movies. He's a very seasoned producer. And the relationships with sponsors have only gotten deeper. They have some fantastic new sponsors that are very esteemed and quality sponsors helping them. The folks at Cannes one year told me, you think it's easy, but we have to reinvent the wheel every year. We have to find sponsors and replenish the well. So it's not easy for anyone, but Karlovy Vary seems to be doing it quite well. If
I could ask you a couple of questions about yourself. Your background is Slovak, is that right? The name must have been Gaydos?
It's Gaydos. Gaydos, and if you meet Hungarians, they say, well, that's silly. It's not Slovak. It's Hungarian, because Slovakia is ethnically Hungarian. Gombos was my grandmother's name, and we know that's Hungarian. So my family, I visited their villages out east of Mihalotza, in a little village called Klokacho, was my grandmother's village. I took my daughter there. So Eastern Slovakia near the Ukraine border is where my father's parents came from and migrated to America. And then on the other side, I'm German and English. So I'm another mutt from Europe, landed in America.
I also wanted to ask you, you have encyclopedic knowledge of movies. What are some of your favorite Czech or Czechoslovak films?
Well, I love everything that Ivan Passer did, whether it was in Czechoslovakia or in America. I think Cutter's Way is the greatest film ever made about Vietnam, and it takes place in Santa Barbara. So I would encourage people to see Ivan Passer, Cutter's Way with Jeff Bridges. I think, Miloš's early movies, I interviewed him one time and I said, would you like to go back to making those kind of intimate, small movies you made in the Czechoslovakia? He said, no, I always wanted to make big Hollywood movies. I just made the films that I had the money to make. So it wasn't that I was aesthetically drawn to making little movies like Fireman's Ball. You got to remember, I'm old enough to have known about the Prague Spring. I wrote letters in support of Havel. I knew what was happening to Dubček. The Prague Spring filmmakers, I've talked with Ken Loach about how much the Czech New Wave influenced his work. So there's a wonderful reservoir. There's a great Slovak director named Dusan Hanek, and I showed his movie 35 years ago called Pictures of the Old World. And that's a fantastic documentary that was banned by the Soviets, because it was too honest about the plight of old people in Czechoslovakia.
And over the years, have you known many Czech or Czechoslovak directors personally?
I knew Ivan Passer quite well. I'd met Jan Nemetz. I brought Bob Shea over because Bob Shea, New Line Films, the whole history of New Line with Lord of the Rings and the Oscars and the big company that was sold for $1 billion, that all started with Czech cinema. So we brought him over and he met Jan Nemetz, whose film he had distributed. We're talking about back in like 1968. So the continuity and the importance and the connectivity between people, it might be a bit deeper than people realize.
Do you think it's a pity that Passer didn't make more films? I know he made a few after he left Czechoslovakia, but not very many.
It's a tragedy, That's the kind of film buff I am. I wish there were 5 or 10 more Peckinpah films, 5 or 10 more Nick Roeg films, 5 or 10 more films from my partner, Monty Hellman. And Monty and Ivan were great friends. By the way, I met someone the other day who knew Ivan, and before I could say, was he the greatest personal storyteller you ever met? They said to me, and Ivan was the greatest personal storyteller I ever met. The man was born to tell stories. So, I wish there were more Ivan Passer films. But as someone said at a tribute to Peckinpah when he passed away, let's not talk about what didn't happen. Let's talk about the ones that happened that are there for us. So Intimate Lighting, of course, is a must-see for everyone who hasn't seen that Ivan Passer film. But I like his little films like Law and Disorder with Carol O'Connor and Ernest Borgnine. I like Born to Win. I saw it again recently. I think it's a much bigger and more important film than people realize. De Niro is in it, almost at the very beginning of his career. So you got me talking about a guy that I really loved personally and as a filmmaker.
Many thanks indeed to Steven Gaydos, who I spoke to remotely just days after the death of Jiří Bartoška in May 2025, for this episode of Prague Talk. Prague Talk is produced by Radio Prague International, and if you're new to the pod, why not look up some of the many earlier editions and subscribe wherever you get podcasts. But that's all for now from me, Ian Willoughby. Thank you so much indeed for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again very soon.